Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arlith. Russian forces continue to grind on the front lines. Of course, we have been talking about and will talk about the critical situation that exists in and around Pokrovsk. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russia is looking to consolidate its gains in that strategically important sector of the front line. Meanwhile, Russia is also seeking to erode frontline forces by striking Ukrainian rear logistics. This could prove very costly for Pokrovsk itself and the Ukrainian fortress belt in the Donbass. We'll discuss this with our guest, but first, these reports from Ukraine this week. This week, Russia escalated mass drone salvos while Ukraine struck deep at refineries and Black Sea assets, reinforced defenses around Pokrovsk, and secured fresh Western backing. U.S. President Donald Trump reiterated on November 3rd that his administration will not send long-range Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine.
Our administration provide Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk missiles? Is that something that you're not considering that?
No, not really.
On the same day, Kyiv announced new German-supplied Patriot systems entering service, with President Volodymyr Zelensky saying that more are needed to shield cities and energy sites.
Хочу подякувати канцлеру Мерцу, дякую Німеччині та всім, хто допомагає. Наші домовленості, вони виконані. Є ще патріоти в Україні. Включаємо в роботу.
In Brodo, Norway, defense ministers from the UK, Norway, and Ukraine pledged tighter joint expeditionary forces cooperation on training, infrastructure protection, and lessons from the battlefield.
Ukraine's advantage is that we test weapons in real combat conditions in real time. From partners including GEF countries, Ukraine seeks access to European technologies and production capacities on the basis of which we could launch joint manufacturing.
Sweden's Ulf Kristersson and Estonia's Kristen Michal called for tougher EU sanctions, curbs on the shadow fleet, and long-term isolation of Russia, tying frozen Russian assets to Ukraine's reconstruction.
We must move quickly with the 20th package. Let's keep targeting Russian fossil exports and the shadow fleet. This is a danger to both our security and our environment.
The situation on the ground in Ukraine remains dire. Evacuations intensified this week around Kostiantynivka as the police unit, White Angel, pulled residents from frontline streets under drone threats. Officers say that driving into Pokrovsk is no longer possible.
We ask people to leave on foot to the nearest villages, which is where we can pick them up. Cars are the number one target.
In a sign of solidarity, Hollywood movie star Angelina Jolie visited Kherson this week, meeting children and medical staff. President Zelensky visited troops near Dobropilya on November 4th, meeting the Azov First Corps to discuss drones and supply. Kyiv says a mid-October Russian push there lost 16 armored vehicles. Pokrovsk remains the focal point of Russia's grinding advance. Ukraine's general staff rejects encirclement claims, saying flanks are being reinforced around Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, and logistics routes secured. And now joining us to discuss the latest on the battlefield is George Barros. George is the Russia Team and Geospatial Intelligence Team Lead at the Institute for the Study of War. George, thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Hi, Don. Thanks so much for having me. Good to see you once again.
Yes, now I'm not going to beat around the bush. The situation around Pokrovsk is dire. Although officials say that the situation is under control, we know that Ukrainian forces are outnumbered by around 8-1, and their ability to continue to hold on looks worse and worse by the day. What is your latest assessment there at the Institute for the Study of War on this part of the front line?
Yeah, absolutely. So Pokrovsk is going to fall. The city's been compromised, and it's really a question of time. And it's a question of time of how many days or potentially how many weeks. It's also a question of, will the Russians be able to successfully seize not only Pokrovsk, but the larger pocket that's there along with Mirnohrad? Right now, the tactical situation is very difficult. Russian forces are infiltrating and fighting deeper and deeper into the city. The Russians have managed to get into a decent amount of the city, but in smaller numbers. It's not as if they're deploying very large groups. I mean, these are smaller teams that they're sending in, but they're causing significant problems. The key thing here that I want to talk about is, look, as we talk about Pokrovsk and the Battle of Pokrovsk and really the campaign for Pokrovsk, we have to put this into context and perspective. Pokrovsk didn't fall in the last week. It didn't fall in the last month. It didn't fall in the last year. The Russians have been waging a 20-month campaign to seize Pokrovsk. This was the main Russian operational objective starting since the fall of Avdiivka back in February of 2024. And the Russians have spent about 20 months to advance about 40 kilometers and have lost, upwards of 100,000 casualties over the last 2 years just trying to advance in this one single area. And so within this context and the creeping advance the Russians have made, we really have to think about Pokrovsk and how it served its job in buying the Ukrainians time and space.
Yeah, now, logistically, the main highway from both sides is blocked. How can they resupply? And do you think they're going to even attempt to hold on to that pocket for much longer? Or is that a big risk to the forces that are there?
It's a risk for the forces that are there. The main objective for the Ukrainians at this point really should be withdraw their forces in as best order as possible to minimize casualties. But I have to tell you, withdrawing while in contact with the enemy is one of the most, if not the most difficult tasks that a soldier or a unit can perform. I mean, this is exceedingly difficult, exceedingly dangerous, and very hard to do. So a lot of eyes are looking now and to the extent to which the Ukrainians are able to succeed in doing that. There are a very small number of roads and some urban blocks that are crucial to ensuring that the Ukrainians can actually manage to withdraw in good order, but we'll see. The key thing here, though, is really that the whole area is under reconnaissance from drones and enabled to be striked by drones, and this is really a key problem. And it's not a problem. It was not just a problem now in the context of withdrawing and protecting your egress routes. It was also a problem that enabled the Russian capture of Pokrovsk. You know, in retrospective, what enabled this was the fact that the Russians have been thinking very smartly and deeper about how to degrade a frontline strong post like Pokrovsk. And they achieved that effect over the course of several months by using drones with longer ranges, with the fiber optic cables to degrade Ukrainian logistics, deny the use of the highways, not in the last mile of logistics, but 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers out. And in doing so, attrit the frontline defenders and set the conditions for eventually storming them. It's therefore extremely important that the Ukrainians not only build these fortress cities and these fortified strongpoint positions, but also eliminate and destroy the threat of the Russian intermediate drone capability, because these effects mount over time and they mature into ugly situations.
How would you compare this situation in Pokrovsk to what we saw back in Bakhmut? I mean, I know the war has significantly changed in its reliance on drones, as you just mentioned. But in terms of loss of personnel and men and lives for the Ukrainians, did they fare better in and around Pokrovsk than, say, was the case near Bakhmut back in 23?
So this is a really interesting question. Both are sort of urban fights. Pokrovsk is significantly smaller and less built up than Bakhmut, so it's less of an intense urban fight. And it's also a much smaller city, and the tactics have evolved and changed. The drone denial and drone reconnaissance was not quite as strong or robust in 2022, 2023 during the Battle of Bakhmut as it was now. What I'd also note is that when the Battle of Bakhmut got into its high point, when the urban fighting happened, the Russians were a lot less, I think, tactful in how they would do their urban combat and their fighting, because what really was the key thing that won that was mass of prisoner soldiers recruited by the Wagner Group, who flung themselves in tremendous large numbers and inhuman waves to overwhelm and move street by street, block by block. the Russians aren't wasting personnel quite the same way that they are in the Battle of Pokrovsk now as they were in Bakhmut. They still waste a lot of personnel, and Russian infantry assaults are casualty heavy. But the Russians don't send large groups of 50 people in a penal group at a single time. They send groups of 2 to 3, maybe 5 people at a time to try to more intelligently infiltrate and sneak their way in to get to pre-established assembly areas, wait for a couple more guys to join, consolidate, and then push forward and onto there. So it's a little bit more nuanced, and they've needed to do that because I think the Russians are trying to not lose as many people quite as rapidly as they did at Bakhmut, but also more importantly, the Ukrainian drones are much more capable of denying those sorts of advances. What I'd also note is when we talk about drones and we talk about urban warfare, we need to take into account that once you're actually inside the urban environs, drone effectiveness quite precipitously drops off. The drones are most effective in the fields and the rolling hills adjacent to these urban belted areas where the drone pilots actually have unobstructed sight of vision, and they have unobstructed radio waves, and there's very little cover concealment for the advancing forces. But once those advancing forces do find cover and concealment in an urban environment, the effectiveness of those drones really degrades. So the drone defenses worked great for the 40 kilometers moving up to Pokrovsk environs, which is why that slog took so long. But then once the Russians actually got into the city, they were then able to metastasize and advance at a faster rate.
Does that make the case for, say, for Ukraine to send in infantry troops and, do the kind of really dirty, close combat that we've seen in these urban settings? Or is it a personnel factor that weighs down Ukraine for making such a decision?
So, look.
Or is it just not worth maybe holding on at this point?
Look, at this point, the city has achieved its objective. The reason why the Ukrainians thought that Pokrovsk, the reason why Pokrovsk was operationally significant is because it was a good logistics hub with the highway there and the railroad. But the Russians effectively denied the utility of Pokrovsk as a logistics hub in summer of 25, if not sooner, because they were successfully already striking and denying its use as logistics hubs with the drones and other long-range strike assets. The subsequent campaigning to seize the city was simply just, on top of achieving your objectives of denying a logistics hub, now we're going to just take terrain for the sake of taking terrain. And that, I think, has been wasteful on the Russians' end. At this point, I think it would be prudent for the Ukrainians to try to withdraw in good order and try to preserve whatever manpower that they actually can within the area. There are ways that you could send in some tactical counterattacks, which the Ukrainians have done to try to stabilize the flanks, enable that withdrawal. But at this stage of the battle, it's probably not time to send in more infantry, because number one, you really can't. This drone threat that the Russians bring forward is quite pernicious, and a requirement that we're observing is that the Ukrainians have to get better at striking the Russians not only in the 0 to 25 kilometer range, but at a deeper range, an operational range, the kind of range at which you would use HIMARS to strike the Russians.
Okay, well, that brings us up to the fortress belt. If we're looking at the remains of the Donetsk region, what would this mean for those cities, for Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Kostiantynivka, Druskivka? How many forces have to really stay behind and stop the advance, I guess, down there to the south, and then what? Do they redeploy forces to fortify the areas there on the fortress belt?
Yeah, it's a great question. So correlation of forces is not an exact science. So it depends on the frontage that you're looking at, but it also depends on what your adversary is bringing to bear, and also how does the terrain and the nature of your defensive fortifications hold it out. I think the key thing here is the Ukrainians need to focus on protecting their rear area logistics. Just yesterday or the day before, the Ukrainian railroad Ukrzaliznytsia announced that they had to actually shut down the railroad from Kharkiv to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, and that's actually quite bad because that railroad is critical for logistics, and they're doing so due to drone threats. These railroads run more than 50 kilometers away from the current front line. And it's really, really problematic that if the Russians are able to basically just shut down Ukrainian logistics in the intermediate rear. Because guess what? Your frontline defenders, no matter how strong they are, no matter how many there are, if you can't get them bullets, batteries for drones, grenades for drones, warheads for drones, medicine, supplies, fuel, it doesn't matter how many there are there. You need to actually have that secure supply line. And so I actually think the requirement is going to be, yes, getting sufficient troops there, but more importantly at this point, ensuring that you're not going to be cut off from your life source and the logistics in the rear. And the Russians, and in particular the Rubicon group for unmanned forces, unmanned systems, they have prioritized developing a very sophisticated capability for interdicting and denying logistics, not just last mile logistics, but into the rear.
George, I've had you on this show many times before. We've been talking about how Ukrainians should be doing the exact same on the Russian supply lines, hence the argument for HIMARS and what have you. What's happened to that? Is Ukraine failing on this objective? Are they concentrating maybe on other things, such as imposing their own sanctions on, and making on Russian oil and making deep strikes into Russia? Should they be focusing on also their adversaries, supply lines right there along the front lines?
Absolutely. The Ukrainians do need to focus on the intermediate drone range, and the Ukrainian military is not a monolith. There's different units and different commanders that are paying a lot of close attention to this, but there also are some that I think are not paying adequate attention to this. And one of the things that we're trying to do at ISW is raise attention to the need for the intermediate strikes. We're in an interesting place here where the Ukrainians actually used to have an intermediate range strike capability in the form of HIMARS Gimlers. But unfortunately, the Russian electronic warfare and protection game has increased such that HIMARS, their efficacy have been greatly diminished and reduced to the point that they're not really able to achieve the effects that they used to be able to in, say, 2022 and 2023. So because of that, the Ukrainians now have to get creative and think about using drones for achieving those sorts of same effects. And ironically, the Ukrainians have a very lethal tactical close range drone kill zone from the 0 to 25 kilometer range. Mm-hmm. They have a effective long range strategic drone campaign targeting Russian energy infrastructure, sometimes thousands of kilometers away from the front line. Or not thousands, several hundreds, up to 1,000. But this intermediate range of like 30 to 120 kilometers, this is a place where the Russians, unfortunately, recently have been operating with relative immunity. And there needs to be a strong demand signal for industry to create the systems to conduct those sorts of strikes. But also, we have to get the commanders thinking about how do we deny those sorts of strikes using drones or any other weapon systems that can achieve those effects.
And also for logistics, I mean, you mentioned those railroads. I've been along that railroad. I know how the roads are. I mean, just the roads in that direction, when you had to go around the main highway that takes you up to Izium, it's a disaster. So are you telling me that is probably going to be the main supply lines for Ukrainian forces now in their most dire hour as they have to defend these cities?
Candidly, I'm not sure how the Ukrainians are going to do it. We don't study the Ukrainian logistics or collect on our allies, so I need to look into it. I'd note that the announcement of the rail line being closed was for civilian rail travel. I suppose it's possible that they might limit that to military rail travel, but perhaps not. But yeah, I mean, if not the rails, then they're confined to using the roads. Mm-hmm. And said it very eloquently, the roads are suboptimal. They're not ideal. And so this leads to a very scary implication, which is, okay, we've had Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Drushkivka, the fortress belt built up for a decade plus to be these, massive fortified centers against a future Russian invasion, and they're really great, strong positions to hold. But if they're weakened from the inside by having the logistics stripped of them, then actually that kind of is a key assumption about the utility of these positions that comes into question. So it's super critical that the Ukrainians defeat this intermediate drone threat and secure their rear areas.
Okay. All right. Moving up further north, we've also seen Kupiansk, Russian forces taking into the center of the city. It also looks like they're moving along the Oskil River, going into the south. Now there's a new push towards Borova. So what is the Russian strategy on that part of the front line? Are they trying to create this little buffer zone along that little strip of the Kharkiv region there next to Luhansk? Or are there designs, in your opinion, for a further push into Kharkiv if possible?
The Russians, they're going to push further into Kharkiv. That's the objective. They also want to, of course, seize the remainder of Luhansk. There is a small portion of Luhansk that the Russians don't control. It's less than 1%. It's a very small amount of rural territory. But the Russians want to get on the other side of the Oskil River, because these rivers are major impediments to maneuver warfare. The Russians historically have been very challenged with crossing water obstacles in this war. And so in order to be able to continue their offensives and go deeper into Ukraine in different places, they need to get across these rivers. The rivers are also sort of a double-edged sword. If they can manage to secure lodgements on the other side of a river, then those remaining Ukrainian positions still on that same side of the river then have to deal with Russians that are contesting the banks to be able to supply their forces that are on the other side of the river. So it would be sort of an envelopment of Ukrainian forces by getting around to the other side of the river as well. The situation in Kupiansk is also challenging. Russian forces have been quite successful in getting small numbers of groups into the city with infiltration, which really goes to just show how interesting and dynamic the war continues to be. The Russians managed to develop concept of operation and tactics that allow the Russians to do sort of a foot mobile version of operational maneuver over a long time, even though the Ukrainians have effectively denied the use of Russian tanks for anything that resembles a blitzkrieg. So the war is most certainly not stalemated. The lines change all the time. It's slow, but it mounts, and it shows us the extent to which the Russians are actually dedicated to seizing more terrain, achieving the Kremlin's objectives, and going deeper into terrain that the Russians officially have not declared annexed. I'd note for you as well, the Russians are not only advancing in Kharkiv, but they're also advancing in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in southern Ukraine as well, another province which the Russians have not officially declared annexed.
Right. So in summary here, to sum things up very briefly, what are you looking forward to seeing coming out here to stop this horrible advance along the front lines in several sectors until the end of the year?
So Pokrovsk is going to fall. We assess that it is not likely going to create a massive hole in the Ukrainian line, and it's not going to facilitate any sort of operational breakthrough that the Russians are likely to exploit. We are likely going to keep looking at more grinding, slow positional warfare and more of these infantry-led infiltration efforts, which then eventually get consolidated and pushed into larger gains. Our current assessment, and this is based off of the way that the Russian command has positioned their units and their better units and organized their forces in the order of battle, is that the Russians will likely prioritize the fortress belt after completing the seizure of the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd pocket. And in particular, we think that they're going to prioritize the city of Kostiantynivka because of its geography. It's the closest to the front line, but it's also the fortress belt city that the Russians are trying to attack from not just the east, but also from the south and also the southwest from that Dobrapilya salient that they developed a little bit back in August of this year. So they might try to do a type of multi-directional south, southeast, southwest attack against that to try to work their way into it. Simultaneously, they're going to continue intensifying their efforts to degrade the logistics, evidenced by the railroad closures announced yesterday. And the key thing for the Ukrainians are going to be, how do they secure their rear line logistics? How do they deny the Russian intermediate drone threat? How do the Ukrainians impose and extend the range of that tactical drone kill zone so that they kill things that are deeper in the Russian intermediate rear? And also, how do they effectively counter these Russian infiltration tactics, especially when the weather gets bad? One of the major downsides of this Ukrainian drone wall is that when it's rainy, windy, or foggy, the efficacy of Ukrainian drones really goes down. And the Russians have actually been exploiting crummy weather to make these advances.
All right, well, that's what we know now to be on the lookout for. George Barros, the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead at the Institute for the Study of War. Thank you, as always, for being my guest. Thank you for coming on Ukraine This Week.
Thanks for having me, Don. Always a pleasure.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thank you for joining us and hope to see you then. Goodbye.